Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Bierman.
It's great.
We have a number of things to talk about this weekend on your weekend show. But I want to do in this first segment of the program today is address some of you, especially that listen to shortwave radio, and some of my friends that have been in the radio business for 30, 40, and even 50 plus years. Some of these guys think that AM radio is going to make a magical comeback, and they laugh at all the new technology. I think just like people laughed at the horseless carriage, maybe we need to take advantage of the technology in front of us and stop living in the past.
Happy and I'm smiling, walking mile to drink your water. You know I love to love you, and above you there's no other. We'll go walking out while others shout of war's disaster. Oh, we won't give in, let's go living in the past. Join in, every boy and girl was my friend. Now there's revolution, but they don't know what they're fighting. Let us close our eyes outside their lies, go on much faster. Oh, we won't give in, we'll keep living in the past.
So how many of my listeners remember that song by Jethro Tull, the song Living in the Past? Well, that song came out over a half century ago. Hard to believe that song was released. Basically, that song was released 51 years ago this past month. It was just beginning to get traction at a lot of local radio stations that I can remember back in 1969. Back then, I listened to a radio station in a small community in upstate New York. And I remember they finally got around to playing it by the spring. There were some of those album-oriented FM radio stations you could pick up that would play Jethro Tull and that song, Living in the Past. You know, I was thinking, I look at that song, I listen to that song because of my age bracket, and it sounds just like it was just yesterday that I heard that song, or just last week. And I have a hard time envisioning that it has been 51 years ago since that song was popular. To put that in a reference, 51 years ago, in 1969, if you had gone back 50 years, you'd be in 1918. people that were my age then were remembering the days before radio stations ever went on the air. Maybe the first wind-up and crank-up Victrola sets may have played some records. Or people, to make music in their homes, they would buy sheet music at a store, and somebody would play the piano. That's how much things have changed in our world in 100 years, let alone the last 50 some odd years. And so what I'm trying to say to a lot of my friends listening, and I know a lot of you listen on shortwave, there's a very dedicated group of people that are still shortwave enthusiasts for what, and some do it because they believe in it, some enjoy it. For many, it's just a hobby to see how many different radio stations they can log. I know of a whole group of people that just spend their time fiddling the dial, as my parents would say, listening and trying to find radio stations on shortwave from obscure places. It's a hobby to them. It's the DX hobby. I think some of us, myself included, had a bit of that hobby back in my high school years, and when I first looked at ham radio as an option and a possible thing to do, to be able to use amplitude modulation and skywave to reach far corners of the globe. But things have changed. And what we thought was important 50 years ago, not as important as it is today. And 50 years ago, what people thought then about the other 50 years ago, or like 100 years ago now, well, things have certainly changed. And as you look at some of the changes that came into the world in terms of technology, science, and just our industrial revolution in the Western world, there are a lot of things that came about after the year 1919 or 1920 that why would we ever want to go back to 1920 from the year 2020? How many people would be willing to give up a dependable automobile? How many of us in this modern age would be willing to live without decent heating and air conditioning in our homes, especially those that may live in a tropic climate or somewhere in the deep part of the southeast? How many want to give up their telephones? How many want to give up their radios? How many want to give up basically their appliances, their microwave ovens, and all the other conveniences that have come along in these past 100 years? I mean, we were just getting accustomed to the idea of an electric light bulb, a horseless carriage, and a telephone, and a phonograph, and the beginnings, long before the ability to record the human voice. We were beginning to see motion pictures in black and white with somebody playing the piano. And now motion pictures are in high definition with computer-generated effects and can literally take you to places that you could never go otherwise except in your imagination. There are a lot of things sometimes we leave behind that we shouldn't as we move forward in time, and that's going to be part of the program today, the things we should not leave behind. But there are some things in life that are better left behind. Truly. 50 years ago, I couldn't wait until I had that opportunity to be on the radio. My goal in life was to be a radio announcer on an AM radio station. And I had basically in my mind at that time, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do one of two things? Either just stay in my little hometown and hope that midday radio air shift opens up. The one from like 9 in the morning till about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. that air shift, and work Monday through Friday playing records in a studio with a microphone and some specialized tape recording machines. And wouldn't that be a wonderful career to stay in my hometown and just talk to people on the radio? After all, this radio station on AM was very popular in our community at the time. I mean, virtually everybody listened to that radio station. They did. It was the number one radio station in our community. If you were to look at, you remember the old type push-button radios, and you could kind of see the little red marker where the dial was set. If you were to go through a parking lot and just kind of casually glance into the windshield, because this is before digital radios, you could see that, the dial was set to like around 1400, around 1200, or a little bit lower. And you could just tell by looking at the car radio of a parked vehicle what radio station they were listening to in that car. And I can tell you beyond the shadow of a doubt, the radio station I was at in our community in upstate New York was by far the number one radio station. Probably for every 3-1, 2-1 or 3-1 easily in that community, because the tower's right there in town and the signal's nice and clean. But that's not true in that town anymore. That AM radio station is not as popular as it once was. A lot of people are no longer listening. And some people will say, well, it's because corporations bought up radio stations. Baloney. It's not just because corporations bought up radio stations. In some cases, and some people will tell you, and I'm going to correct this right now for those that are listening, that the FCC, if they had never allowed corporate ownership radio, it'd still be the same way it was. I don't think so. Things sometimes, especially in the areas of technology and our taste, change over time. And different generations, like mine and my parents and my grandparents before them, all had different taste in a lot of things. It doesn't make one wrong and one right. It's just the way things are generationally. I came up where I don't remember a time when there wasn't a television in the house. And my father grew up in a time when he doesn't remember when there was radio in the house. Different times, different technologies. And when my grandparents were growing up, they didn't remember TV or radio because they had neither. They had books. They had kerosene lanterns in some cases. That's what has happened in the past 100 years. And so when we look at radio today, I'm going to talk first here about domestic radio, AM and FM in the United States. It's going through changes. There's no doubt about it. And some will say, well, it's because we allowed corporate radio. They just ruined it. They ruined it. They just got rid of all the local ma stations. Well, the ma stations that you love so much were very willing to sell those frequencies and make a lot of money and retire to Florida or wherever they went. So apparently their commitment to the cause was never that great to begin with in many cases. Let's be honest. If I owned the little radio station in upstate New York that I worked at, and somebody came to me, if I still owned it in the 1990s, or around 1996 and beyond, and someone offered me a lot of money, you better believe I'd be retiring early and heading to Florida from the snowbound regions of upstate New York. Let's just be honest about that. That's where it is. But there's so many other things that some of my friends in the radio business also ignore. Number one, in terms of commercial viability, there's a lot more competition today for the advertising dollars that local radio station used to collect in that little town in upstate New York the only real competition that radio station had in our city, village, and county was the local little newspaper. That was the only competition. Television came out of another big city far away and was just too expensive for a local merchant to ever consider spending a penny on advertising. Today we have cable TV selling advertising. We have all kinds of new online options and digital advertising that people are investing money in because it's inexpensive compared to conventional means. And that AM radio that used to be the only thing you had in your car in 1969, by the 1980s was an AM/FM radio, or AM/FM cassette, or AM/FM CD, and now we have satellite radio, and we connect our phones, literally in many cases, right to our dashboard to play our iTunes or whatever music we have collected that we would rather hear, or even things that are streaming. The world is changing, and this is what I'm trying to tell my friends who think that if only a little AM radio station would just, get a couple of local announcers to spin some records, everybody would come back. That's what the guy that made the buggy for the horse and buggy was saying in 1900. If we just get a nicer buggy, people won't buy that horseless carriage thing. I can't imagine many of these same people that are talking about how they would love to see AM radio come back. How many would give up their car for a horse and buggy to do their traveling? What I'm trying to tell you is that radio is going to be going through some changes, just like everything else in this world. While I have fond memories of 1969, fond memories of getting on radio in 1971, fond memories of the years that I spent on AM radio, then FM, and then building stations, owning a station. I've watched over the 50 years, analytically, how this industry has changed. The economics sometimes force the hand of technology to make up the losses. Shortwave radio still has an audience around the world, and I think will continue to have an audience of some type for years to come. Yet I also recognize that the large number of people that got into listening to shortwave because it was something rather new again in the United States in particular. Shortwave was a big deal back in the 30s and 40s, and then by the 1950s was basically drifting away. My grandparents' radio in their living room back in the 1930s and 40s was AM with shortwave. They could hear all the local radio stations out of New York City and even Long Island. And they could also listen to the BBC and other voices from overseas during the Second World War. But how many radios in people's homes contained shortwave by 1960? Unless you specifically bought a radio that was a world band radio, you didn't see it. People enjoy the hobby, and a lot of people believe, like I do, it's going to be one of our saving graces during a time of emergency. But try to pass that knowledge on to somebody under the age of 25. How many people do you know under the age of 25 that even willingly listen to conventional AM or FM radio, let alone shortwave? They don't even know what it is. How many of those young people you and I know listen to earbuds or headphones and Bluetooth, and they're attached to their telephone? See, the world has changed. the world is changing. And sometimes we have to stop living in the past and recognize that we need to use the technology that's before us today. In my work in ministry, would I go out and buy airtime around the country for this radio program on a local AM radio station? They would be very expensive. And honestly, having put this station on this program on a few small stations, I never had any results. The listenership is that small in a lot of towns today, and it's sad. I'm thinking of a radio station right now that back in the 1950s and the 1960s and all the way into the mid-1970s, almost to 1980, was the most popular radio station in their community. I can think of a number of stations that had a legacy that went on for 25 or 30 or plus years. And then the world changed. That AM radio station didn't have an FM, and people were moving to FM. And now we have the internet, and we have other things that are competing for our entertainment time. And so what I'm telling you today, for those that are smart enough to catch what I'm saying, I still enjoy listening to things on AM and shortwave because I remember what they were. And I have fond memories of those times. But I recognize that even this radio show in particular, the audience is increasing rapidly as a podcast more so than a radio program. That's just the reality, whether you like it or not. And I can't change that. And I'm glad that those that are listening as a podcast have stayed with me these past 19 minutes in my little rant and rave about living in the past. This now is directed to people of faith in their churches and their ministries. It's hard to comprehend this sometimes. And this is one of those times where you got to be careful what you toss aside and what you keep. I said I was going to talk about that. One of the things that I miss from 50 years ago, yeah, sure, we had seen some riots in the United States. We had seen some pretty terrible things in the 1960s, but back in the 1960s, I knew my neighbors. I knew the people that lived next to me, across the street, and behind us. We all did. We all had a higher level of civility 50 years ago. We tended to open doors for people more so than we do today. We were a bit more caring. And it was the exception, those that were arrogant and uncaring, where today those that care are the exception in too many places. Those are the things we should never have left behind. I'm glad we have the technology we have today. I'm glad we have the improved medical technology and sciences that we have today. I really am. I don't think I'd want to go back to the 1920s when it comes to medicine. I wouldn't want to go back to the 1920s for our technology either. I feel very blessed to have lived in a time to see the explosion of technology right before my very eyes each and every year. And how fast technology has grown. I remember back in the late 1970s, the first little computers we saw. Everything measured in kilobits, not even megabits. Speeds. We thought a speed of 2 megs was incredibly fast. And now we expect it to be 1,000 times or more faster. We thought memory written in kilobits, and someday getting up to 1 megabit was huge. And now we talk no longer in gigabytes, we talk in terabytes, trillions of bytes of information. I've seen all that unfold before my very eyes in 20, 25 years. There's a lot of good things out there, a lot of great tools if we use them. But in order to be effective in all that we do, learn from the past, retain those things that are good. But you want to know something? We can never go back to yesterday. We can no longer hold on to yesterday because yesterday is not coming back. We live moving forward in time. I'm at that age where there are many fond memories from a period of time 25, 30, 40, 50 plus years ago. The Christmases past, the birthdays past, the summer times at the beach gone by. Places you visit, people you knew. There's a lot of wonderful memories. There are a lot of memories in the past. But you can't change them. We have today. And as the years go by, we have less years we can use for things that are important. And I've said it a million times before, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, making effective use of our time. If we keep holding on to yesterday, if we keep dwelling on what happened in days gone by, and we don't stop and do everything we can in the here and now, then what are we really trying to accomplish? Yesterday is not coming back. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Bierman.
I keep thinking that I'm
It was the summer of 1975. I remember it well. Ambrosia. And the song I keep holding on to yesterday. 45 years ago, in June of that year, I was working at a radio station. I'd been in the radio business now at that point about 4 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about radio. Just ask me, I would have told you. And I can remember playing that song. I was working at an AM/FM radio station in Georgia. And back in those days, the AM was just covered the town, really, and part of the county, and the FM was actually powerful and covered a pretty good amount of real estate. Yet back in 1975, the majority of the people in that community and county listened to the little AM radio station, and not so much me being the afternoon guy on the FM radio station. FM was growing in popularity, but still nowhere near the popularity of most AM stations in 1975. Funny how by 1980 that all had changed. Dramatically had changed in just 5 years. If I had stayed with my original career path that I envisioned in 1970, 50 years ago, and not prepared to be able to do something else in my life, I would have been in a pretty bad way by the 1990s. There were a lot of people that were radio announcers in the 60s and the 70s, and even the 80s, and unless you were incredibly good, as formats became more automated and money a little bit tighter, it just became not that great of a career as it had been when I started. When I started, I'll be honest, when I started way back in radio in the good old days, it appeared to be a great career path. Especially if you could do one of two things back in those days. You could either go to work, as I said before, for a well-established local radio station where everybody knows who you are, or you work your way up to the higher-paying jobs in the big cities, and there was a lot of competition back in those days for those handful of jobs. But something told me, I guess being married and having to take care of a family, something told me that being a radio announcer, I figured this out in the latter part of the 1970s, there was a little change in my plan. That maybe I should consider getting deeper on the technology side than I already was. Maybe there was a better way to make a living as an engineer instead of being always the vulnerable radio announcer whose job could be gone with one rating book change or the tightening of the belt and somebody else that would work cheaper. There are not near as many engineers as there are radio announcer wannabes. And that just seemed a good way to survive. And so I made that transition, as I've told you before, and I'm glad that I did because it opened up doors that never would have opened otherwise. I think of my career in particular, and I look back now. There was a divine hand over me that kept moving me in a different direction before the bottom fell out on what I was doing and where I was working. I mean, honestly, I look back now. One of the radio stations I made a tremendous amount of money at as an announcer compared to, what a lot of people got paid in their regular jobs. Well, it's not even on the air. Its license is gone. It went bankrupt. I couldn't have stayed there 10 years, not even 5 years before things got bad. The station I worked at early in my career, it's gone. There are a lot of radio stations that I've worked at that don't even exist anymore. Their licenses, their AM stations, they're permanently off the air because nobody cared to listen. And they became, the land their tower was on was worth more than the radio station. while I remember those days well, and I have wonderful, fond memories, and I've got photographs to look at, and somewhere I used to even have a few tape recordings of how bad I sounded. I thought I sounded good, but how bad I really sounded on the radio back in my early days. You know, I'm glad for all that I've experienced, but I'm also glad to be in this time in our world history. I know that there are a lot of things that I see around me that are concerning in our world. The secularization of this world. Some of the stupid things I've seen happen in the last 5 years in this world. The unrest, the political angst and anger. Yeah, those are things that political correctness, too, is something that is deeply disturbing. And the fact that our public schools in many cities are nothing more now than indoctrination centers. I'm still glad to be in this time because this is the time that God wanted me to be in. I'll admit, there are times that I've thought, what would it be like? I like listening to old-time radio. What would it be like, truly, to have been born, let's say, in the 1920s, 30s, to have worked in radio back in the 40s and 50s and to make the transition into the kind of radio we had in the 60s, 70s, and then be retired out and done before the world changed and moved to FM. What would my life have been in that time? But that's not the time that I'm in. I came along, and I've had an interest in understanding history in the past, which is something that our young people desperately need to know more of today. We have high school students graduating our public high schools that are completely ignorant about history prior to 20 years ago. They barely even understand the true meaning of 9/11, let alone the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or World War II, and forget World War I. And we all know that old saying, those that, you've heard it 1,000 times before. Those that do not know history are doomed to repeat it, and in many ways we are. When I see some of the things our young people clamor for today in terms of the give me stuff and entitlement, that's what led to the Soviet Union coming into existence 100 years ago. That same attitude. But they don't know the history, and as a result, they're doomed to repeat that history. And that's the sad truth. It really is. How do we address that as we move forward in our world today? What can we do in our world, in our Western world, to teach our kids? Well, parents need to take the responsibility to make up where the school doesn't. Or, and I know it's sacrificial in some cases, consider homeschooling or find a Christian school. I know it's not always an option. You know, we always talk about money more today than we ever did before. It's hard to find families that'll sit down and say, what can we do without to make sure our kids get a better education than what is being taught in the public indoctrination center? I mean, that's how I look at it. What sacrifices are we willing to make for this generation of young people? My generation, the baby boomers, were given a decent education for the most part. Sadly, many of my peers became more indulgent to themselves, and their children started to take a bit of a back seat. Not in every case, but we started seeing a lot of that within my generation. Our children, primarily the Gen Xers, well, they are the parents of many of the millennials and many of today's Gen Z, and they've done a worse job where everything is focused. You know, one of the worst things I ever heard somebody say, and we've heard this on television, we've heard it from the so-called experts, and we've heard it from people trying to justify their careers and justify the way they want to live, and they have children and they have them in daycare and they are constantly working and they are never at home, and you know what I'm talking about. The two worst words to ever enter our vocabulary in the last 30 years were the term quality time. Oh, I know we don't see our children often, but those few hours we do on the weekend, that's quality time. No, it isn't. That's an illusion in your head to make you feel better about the wrong you are doing. I've talked to too many children that are now grown up that hated that idea of quality time. They will talk about their parents never being engaged in their life, but the parents were deceiving themselves into believing they were giving their children quality time. By the early 2000s, we decided to keep our children active and busy in every event possible to give them a heads up. And we've deprived them of their childhoods in some cases. I see a lot of parents also making another huge mistake, trying to live vicariously through their children to do the things they never were able to do. That's another set of mistakes that'll come back to haunt us at some point in the future. It always does. We've talked today about the changes in the past 50 and 100 years so far in the program. We've talked about living in the past. We've talked about holding on to yesterday. And there are some things about the past and yesterday that are worth holding on to because they are values and foundations that are not just 50 years old. See, this is the problem with living in the past type people. They talk about things in their particular formative years as the things we need to go back to. Well, that may be true in some cases, but I'm talking about the things that go back 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, foundational things. The foundational things that we're disposing of so easily and rapidly. Those foundational things are what I'm concerned about. Because when you build your life without a solid foundation, you're liable to be tossed to and fro. And when the winds of life come, easily blown away. I have fond memories of the music of 1969, 1970, and all the way up into the early 80s. And I'm glad that we have technology where I can play that music without even having to have a record player or waiting for a disc jockey to get around to playing my request. You know, back in those days, if you wanted to hear a song, there was only two ways to do it. Go to the store and buy it, or wait till the disc jockey played it. Today, we can purchase music online and never even go to the store. We have sources and resources in front of us to have access to thousands of songs through an Amazon account and other things that we take for granted today. Kids today wouldn't understand the concept of going down to a store and picking up a 45 RPM record to bring home and play on your record player. But back 50 years ago, that's what we did. And hope the store had the record you were looking for and had not run out, especially if you lived in a smaller town. Yesterday is gone. Today is here. And tomorrow we anticipate and have hope. What I've been trying to tell you this weekend on your weekend show is we have to stop living in the past, but learn from it and use much of the past, the things that have stood the test of time, and a lot of things do, build on those foundations. One of the things I'm seeing a lot more of today than I had ever seen before, and I want to share this thought with you. You know, I belong to a very traditional church group, and I'm not ashamed of that. For me personally, I like the older liturgies, and I'm a great fan of the old hymnology. That is my personal, notice what I'm saying here, that is my personal preference. And I see people try to defend, well, we need the old-time Christian music. Well, how do you define old-time Christian music? The stuff written 100 years ago, 500 years ago, or 1,500 years ago? And then, well, we're not talking that. Their idea of the old-fashioned music is the stuff that they remember from their childhood, whatever. It could have been new music then. And that's not the way the music is supposed to work in the church. I remember somebody said something to me many years ago. He was a very wise guy when it came to this. He had been in Christian radio for decades. And he said there's a difference between a hymn and a gospel song. A gospel song is written and it has a shelf life. It has a season. It is popular for a period of time. And then, several years later, it doesn't even sound like something you want to listen to anymore. But it was popular in its day and it had a purpose for that particular time. A hymn is something musically and in its lyrics transcends generations, for generations and generations. There are pieces of music, especially in the lyrics from 1,500 and 2,000 years ago at the beginning of the church, that have as much meaning today as they did back then. Yet I can find some hymns and songs that nobody knows, nobody cares about in these old hymnals. You say, what kind of a tangent are you getting on now? Well, we'll get to that probably next weekend as I get into a different topic. But I just wanted to talk about holding on to yesterday and letting things of the past go. Our minds have incredible filters. We can look back to the past. We can look back to the times we were in high school or college or certain jobs and places, and we think in our mind how wonderful it was back then and how terrible it is today. I was thinking about some of my early years in high school and really, really digging deep in my mind. Were they all that good as I like to remember? And what it boils down to, now listen to me very carefully. We tend to remember moments. Did you hear that? We tend to remember moments. And much of what we lived in the past is basically forgotten. We can sit and daydream about our high school years for an hour and think we have it all covered. We were there for 4 years. A lot more happened in those 4 years than those few memories we like to cling upon and remember. Yesterday is gone. Today is here. And tomorrow we anticipate. Somebody once said that we can't change the past. The future is not yet here, but today is the present, and that is the present we have. Honestly, you'll never change the past. We walk through that period of time. And I've said it 1,000 times on this radio show. Time is a commodity that once it is spent, it can never get a refund, and you can't get it back. So what are you going to be doing with your time? This is your weekend show. Want to remind you about our website, yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com. And from there, you can find all the places you can hear the radio program from the site. But I'm learning that a lot more of you are now beginning to listen online, and that's a good thing. You can listen at your convenience, at your time. If you go to places like iHeartRadio or Spotify or Anchor FM or Spreaker or SoundCloud, you will find your weekend show. Even on Google Podcast and Stitcher and other locations, the program is now beginning to move out into all parts of the world. There are people I know that when a new show is released and put on one of these podcast locations, they get a notification and they can set a time when it's convenient for them to listen. A lot of people download the show just to be safe and listen at their convenience, and they can stop and start when they're doing that too. That's one of the advantages. If you got to answer the phone or do something else, you can, and then you can go back and pick up where you left off. In that way, technology is a blessing to me. I'm finding that I'm enjoying the online world of radio a lot. Yet I still listen to some shortwave, and I still listen to some AM and FM stations. There's still some that are doing a good job. But the world is changing, and that may not be the case for all of those facilities in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. When us baby boomers are too old to be worried about and the Gen Xers become retired, yeah, that day's coming, and that's a scary thought. The world as we know it will change again as technology moves and people's taste change. Just like I was the generation, when you think about it, that really started to like FM radio, and the Gen Xers right behind us. We moved from AM to FM for the most part and watched FM dominate by the 80s in most places. The number one stations in New York used to all be AMs, the first 10 back in the 1970s. Now, the AMs don't even make it into the top 5. And the number of people even listening is less than it was back when I came along. Yeah, the world is changing. It's not always a bad thing. It's having the wisdom. Remember, and we'll get into this next week, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. We can have all the head knowledge in the world, but without the ability to reason and use, knowledge is worthless. We have a whole generation of kids with knowledge at their fingertips, but they don't know how to deploy that knowledge because they have nothing of experience in their lives or any history to compare to understand the world in which we live in today. And oftentimes they make bad decisions as a result of not having that information at their fingertips. It is something that's very important. We can fill a kid's head with knowledge, but we cannot give them wisdom. Wisdom is something you acquire by learning how to use the knowledge to which you're given. This is your weekend show, and we're talking memories today.
When I was young, I'd listen to the radio, waiting for my favorite songs. When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those were such happy times, and not so long ago. How I wondered where they'd gone. But they're back again, just like a long-lost friend. All the songs I love so well. Every sha-la-la-la, every whoa-whoa. before. It's yesterday once more. Looking back on how it was in years gone by, and the good times that I had, makes today seem rather sad. So much has changed. It was songs of love that I would sing to them, and I'd memorize each word. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away. Every sha-la-la-la, every whoa-whoa still shines. Every shing-a-ling-a-ling that they're starting to sing still fine. All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more. Every sha-la-la-la, every whoa-whoa still shines. Every shing-a-ling-a-ling that they're starting to sing so fine. Every sha-la-la-la.
It's funny how time slips away when you're having some good memories. Next week, we're going to take on some really important issues, and I hope that you're here for next weekend's show. Until next week at this same time, may God richly bless you is my prayer.